All right, get ready to dive deep, folks, because today we are tackling consciousness.
Ooh, that's a big one.
Yeah, specifically, we're looking at the representational theory of consciousness,
Ah,
as
yes.
laid out in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Right, right.
This is the kind of stuff that, well, keeps philosophers up at night.
It does. It's a real head scratcher, that's for sure.
It is.
The question of how our brains generate subjective experience, that feeling of what it's like to see a sunset or
Okay.
hear a favorite song, it's one of the biggest mysteries out there.
Totally. And the representational theory offers a pretty unique perspective.
Hmm.
It suggests that maybe consciousness works kind of like
Yeah,
creating a map of the world around us.
exactly. It proposes that conscious experience is fundamentally about representation.
Okay.
Think of it this way. When you look at a red apple, you're not directly experiencing redness itself.
Hmm.
Your brain is generating a representation of that redness based on information coming from your eyes.
So instead of some mysterious redness essence
Right.
floating around in our brains, it's
Exactly.
more like our brain is just constructing a model of redness.
Precisely. And that model can be surprisingly complex.
Okay.
It captures not just the color, but also the shape, the texture, and even the emotional associations we have with that apple.
Okay, I'm starting to get how this representation idea works, but
Yeah.
the article mentions this word intentionality
Hmm.
as a really key part of this. And to be honest with you, that term always trips me up a bit.
It's a tricky one for sure.
Yeah. So can you break that down for me? What does that even mean?
Of course. In this context, intentionality simply refers to the aboutness of our mental states.
Okay.
It means our thoughts, our beliefs, desires, and even our perceptions
Okay.
are always directed towards something. They have an object, whether that object is real or not.
Wait, so you're saying our thoughts could be about things that don't actually exist?
Absolutely.
That's wild.
Imagine, fearing a monster under your bed as a child. That fear, although directed at something imaginary, is still a very real mental state.
Right.
It has intentionality. It's about that monster, even though the monster itself doesn't exist.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So our minds can represent things that are like real,
Uh-huh.
like a physical apple, and things that are totally imaginary, like
Yeah.
unicorns or, well, monsters under the bed.
Exactly. This ability to represent both real and imagined things is central to the representational theory.
Right.
And frankly, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of human consciousness.
It is.
It allows us to engage in abstract thought, to imagine possibilities, to create art and stories that transcend the boundaries of our immediate reality.
Yeah, that's a great point. It makes you realize how powerful this ability to represent things is.
Yeah.
But hold on, isn't consciousness about more than just representing the world? What about the actual feeling of experiencing something?
That's a great question.
Like how do we get that?
You're hitting on what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem.
Yes. How do we explain the subjective qualitative feel
Yeah.
of our experiences? The redness of red,
Right.
the taste of chocolate. These seem like more than just representations.
It's like we can understand like how our brains process sensory information.
Right.
But how does that processing create the actual experience, the feeling of what it's like?
Yeah,
That's the part that feels truly mysterious.
absolutely. And this is where the representational theory gets really interesting.
Okay.
It suggests that those qualitative feelings, those subjective experiences, are themselves also forms of representation.
Hold on. So you're saying the feeling of redness, for example,
Yeah.
is also a representation. How does that work?
Think of it this way. Your brain isn't just representing red as a property of an object.
Okay.
It's also representing what it's like to experience that redness. It's
Yeah.
creating a model of the subjective feeling itself.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So it's like there's a representation of the apple's redness and then a separate representation of what it feels like to see that redness.
Yeah.
Like a double-layered representation.
You're getting it. And this leads to some fascinating questions.
Okay.
For example, if everything is ultimately physical, how can we have these seemingly immaterial qualities of experience?
Right. Like where would the feeling of redness even live in our physical brains?
Right.
It's not like there's a little red light bulb going off in there
Right, haha, exactly.
when we see something red.
The Stanford Encyclopedia entry uses the example of Birdie's green afterimage to illustrate this problem.
Birdie's green afterimage.
Yes. So imagine you stare at a red light for a while, then look at a white wall.
Yeah.
You'll see a green afterimage, a lingering spot of green.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely experienced that before.
Right.
But where is that greenness actually located?
Right.
It's not on the wall, which is white. And it can't be physically in my brain because my brain isn't actually green.
Precisely. This is the dilemma. If that greenness isn't a physical thing, what is it?
Right.
And how does it fit into a purely physical world?
So how does the representational theory address this?
Yeah.
It can't just say, poof, magic.
Of course not. The theory proposes a solution. The greenness of the afterimage, like all sensory qualities, isn't a physical thing in the brain. It's a represented property.
Okay, I need a little more explanation here.
Okay.
What does it mean for something to be a represented property?
Think of it like this. Your visual system is representing a green blob in a specific location.
Okay.
Even though there's no actual green blob there,
Right.
the greenness is part of the content of your experience.
Okay.
But it's not a physical feature of your brain.
So even though it feels like the greenness is in our experience,
Yeah.
it's not actually there.
Exactly. It's more like a description or a model
Okay.
of the greenness rather than the greenness itself.
Hmm.
And this applies not only to hallucinations or illusions,
Yeah.
but to veridical perception as well. When you see a real red tomato, the redness you experience is still a represented property, not a redness that somehow exists inside your head.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this.
Okay.
So according to the representational theory,
Yeah.
the feeling of what it's like to have an experience, whether it's seeing red,
Right.
hearing a melody, or smelling freshly baked cookies,
Yeah.
is actually built from these representations of property.
You're on the right track.
Okay.
It's a pretty radical idea, but it offers a potential solution to some long-standing philosophical puzzles about consciousness
Right.
and its relationship to the physical world.
This is definitely making me rethink how I view my own experiences.
Hmm.
But the article also mentioned that there are different types of representationalism.
Yeah.
Can we maybe unpack that a bit?
Absolutely. There are nuances to how this theory plays out. And understanding those different types will give us a clearer picture of the debates surrounding representationalism.
Perfect. Let's dive into those different types then.
All right, so let's explore these different flavors of representationalism. We'll start with pure representationalism,
Okay.
which argues that representation alone is enough to create a sensory quality.
So just representing something in my mind,
Yeah.
like picturing a strawberry, would be the same as actually experiencing the taste of a strawberry.
Right.
That doesn't seem quite right.
You're right to be skeptical. That's a major issue with pure representationalism.
Yeah.
It doesn't really capture the difference between simply having a representation
Okay.
and having a conscious experience of that representation.
Like I could represent the word pain in my mind, but that's obviously very different from actually feeling pain.
Exactly. It seems like something is missing in that equation.
Right.
So philosophers came up with strong representationalism
Okay.
to address this gap. This view argues that it's not just any representation that creates a sensory quality. It has to be a very specific kind of representation, one that's grounded in how our brains and sensory systems actually work.
So it's not just about the content of the representation, like strawberry,
Right.
but also about how that representation is like physically realized in the brain, like the specific neural patterns firing and all that.
You got it. Strong representationalism brings in these ideas of functionalism,
Okay.
suggesting that mental states are defined by their functional roles,
Okay.
their connections to inputs, outputs, and other mental states.
Ah, okay. So it's like a certain pattern of brain activity corresponds to the experience of strawberry.
Right.
And that pattern is different from the pattern for, say, pineapple,
Right.
even though both are fruits.
Exactly. And this type of representationalism is particularly attractive to materialists.
Materialists.
Yes, philosophers who believe that everything in the universe, including consciousness, is ultimately physical.
So if strong representationalism is true, then we could potentially explain consciousness
Yes.
without having to resort to some mysterious non-physical substance, right?
Right. It would mean that conscious experience, despite its subjective and elusive nature, is ultimately grounded in the physical workings of the brain.
Right.
This would be a huge win for materialists.
Yeah.
And is one of the strongest arguments in favor of this view.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So strong representationalism tries to keep things grounded in the physical world and explain consciousness without invoking anything mysterious.
Right.
What about the third type? What was it called again?
Weak representationalism.
Weak. Okay.
And it takes a bit more of a middle ground approach.
Okay.
It agrees that sensory qualities have representational content,
Okay.
but it acknowledges that there might be more to them than just that.
So it leaves open the possibility that there's something extra,
Yeah.
something we haven't fully grasped yet, that contributes to the feeling of what it's like.
Exactly. Weak representationalism allows for the possibility that there are aspects of consciousness
Okay.
that might not be fully captured by representation alone.
Right.
It's a bit more open-ended, leaving room for further exploration and discovery.
Okay, so we have these three main types: pure, strong, and weak.
Right.
Each with its own take on how representation relates to consciousness.
Yeah.
I'm curious, though, within these types, are there any other debates or disagreements among representationalists?
There are indeed. One particularly interesting debate revolves around whether sensory qualities are narrow or wide.
Narrow versus wide. What does that even mean in this context?
Well, narrow representationalism
Okay.
proposes that if two people have identical brain states, they must have identical sensory experiences.
Okay.
Their inner worlds would be the same, regardless of their environment or personal history.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward.
Right.
So wide representationalism must be the opposite.
You got it. Wide representationalism argues that sensory experiences depend not just on brain states, but also on an individual's environment and their past interactions with the world. So two people with identical brain states could potentially have different experiences based on their unique histories.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
So my conscious experience isn't just in my head,
Right.
but is actually shaped by the world around me and my past experiences.
Yeah.
That's a big shift in perspective.
It is, and it opens up a whole new set of questions
Yeah.
about the nature of subjective experience and its relationship to the objective world. For instance, if my red is based on my specific interactions with red things
Yeah.
throughout my life, could your red be subtly different based on your own experiences?
Whoa, mind blown. That's making me question everything I thought I knew about how I see the world.
It's definitely a thought-provoking concept.
Yeah.
And this leads to some fascinating thought experiments.
Okay.
Like the idea of spectrum inversion. Could two people have their color experiences completely swapped?
Oh, wow.
My red is your blue, my green is your yellow.
Right.
And never know it.
That's trippy. I can only imagine the kind of philosophical arguments that would spark.
Oh, yeah.
But we probably need to, rein it in a bit before
Right.
we go too far down that rabbit hole.
You're right. We've covered a lot of ground just laying out the different types of representationalism.
Right.
But before we move on, I
Yeah.
think it's important to consider the arguments for this theory.
Yeah, good point.
Why should we take this approach to consciousness seriously?
Right.
What makes it compelling?
Yeah, good point. It's easy to get lost in all the definitions
Yeah.
and the different versions, but we need to remember that this is a theory trying to explain something real,
Right.
something we all experience every moment of our lives.
Exactly.
So let's hear those arguments.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've gone through the different types of representationalism:
Right.
pure, strong, and weak, and even dipped our toes into that narrow versus wide debate.
Right.
But I want to hear those arguments
Yeah.
in favor of this theory. What makes representationalism stand out as a potential explanation for consciousness?
Well, one of its biggest strengths is its compatibility with materialism.
Materialism, okay.
Remember, that's the idea that everything in the universe,
Yeah.
including consciousness, is ultimately made up of physical stuff.
Right, the idea that we're essentially complex biological machines,
Exactly.
and there's no need to invoke a soul
Right.
or some other mysterious non-physical entity to explain who we are.
Exactly. And for materialists, explaining consciousness has always been a major challenge.
Right.
How do you account for subjective experience, those feelings of what it's like in a purely physical world?
Right.
Representationalism offers a potential solution by suggesting that those feelings,
Right.
those qualities, are themselves representations, patterns of information encoded in the brain.
So instead of saying that the redness of an apple somehow exists as a non-physical thing in our minds,
Right.
representationalism says it's more like our brains are creating a code, a representation for that redness.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And that code is ultimately physical, just like the neurons and synapses that make up our brains.
Exactly. And this ties into another argument in favor of representationalism, the argument from veridicality.
Veridicality, okay.
We can distinguish between seeing a real apple and hallucinating one.
Right.
But if the feeling of redness is the same in both cases, how do we explain that difference?
Yeah, that's always tripped me up.
Yeah.
If the experience of redness is identical,
Yeah.
whether it's real or imagined, then what makes one true and the other false?
Representationalism argues that the difference lies in whether that representation of redness corresponds to an actual property out in the world. When you see a real apple, your brain's representation of redness accurately reflects a property of that apple. But when you hallucinate, that representation doesn't match anything in reality. It's a mismatch between your internal model and the external world.
Ah, okay, so it's not about the presence or absence of the quality itself.
Right.
But whether that quality is accurately representing something in the world.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
And this leads us to a closely related argument, the argument from transparency.
Transparency, okay.
When we see a red apple, we don't experience our experience of redness. We experience the redness of the apple itself.
Right. It's like we're looking through the experience to the object itself.
Yeah.
Rather than getting stuck in some kind of redness bubble in our minds.
Precisely. This transparency suggests that the redness we experience isn't a separate thing in our minds,
Okay.
but rather a property of the object we're perceiving.
Okay.
And that, again, supports the idea that it's a represented property, a feature of our internal model of the world.
I mean, these arguments are pretty compelling. It seems like representationalism offers a pretty elegant way to fit subjective experience into a materialist worldview.
Right.
But I have to ask,
Yeah.
are there any strong arguments against this theory? I mean, there has to be some pushback, right?
Oh, absolutely. Philosophy wouldn't be much fun if everyone just agreed all the time.
Right. Haha.
One challenge comes from the idea of non-intentional mental states.
Non-intentional.
Remember, intentionality is that aboutness we talked about earlier.
Right. The idea that our thoughts and experiences are always directed towards something.
Exactly. But some argue that not all mental states are intentional.
Okay.
What about moods, for example?
Okay.
Or bodily sensations like pain or pleasure?
Yeah.
It's not always clear what these states are about in the same way that
Right.
seeing a tree or believing in unicorns is about something.
Yeah, that's a good point. Feeling happy or having a stomachache doesn't seem to be representing something in the world in the same way that seeing an apple does.
That's the challenge. Representationalists have a few responses here. They could argue that even moods and bodily sensations have some representational content, even if it's more subtle or less obvious.
Okay.
For example, feeling happy could be seen as representing the world as being generally pleasant or satisfying,
Right.
while a stomachache might represent a state of bodily distress.
So they're trying to find some way to fit those experiences into the representational framework.
Right.
But what if those experiences are truly non-intentional?
Yeah.
What does that mean for the theory?
Well, it could mean that representationalism is only a partial explanation for consciousness.
Okay.
It might capture the aspects of our experience that are clearly about something, our perceptions, beliefs, desires.
Okay.
But it might struggle to account for those more basic, non-intentional feelings and sensations.
That's an interesting possibility. It would suggest that consciousness might be even more complex than we initially thought, with different levels or dimensions of experience. But are there any other challenges to representationalism? Anything that really puts the theory to the test?
There are indeed, and some of the most powerful challenges come from counterexamples.
Counterexamples.
Yes,
Yeah.
specific cases where our experiences seem to contradict the predictions of representationalism.
So like finding a black swan that disproves the claim that all swans are white.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Remember, the core claim of representationalism is that there can't be a difference in sensory qualities
Right.
without a difference in representational content. So if we can find cases where two experiences feel different but supposedly have the same representational content, that would be a problem for the theory.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works.
Yeah.
So these counterexamples are like little cracks in the foundation of representationalism,
Right.
potentially undermining the whole structure.
That's a great analogy. And one of the most famous counterexamples involves the Necker cube.
The Necker cube, okay.
That illusion where a 2D drawing of a cube
Right.
can be seen in two different ways.
Oh, I've definitely seen those. It's like your brain flips back and forth between two different 3D orientations,
Right.
even though the image on the page stays the same.
Exactly. And that's the problem for representationalism.
Hmm.
If the image is the same,
Yeah.
then the representation of that image should also be the same.
Okay.
But if the representation is the same, how can we have two distinct experiences?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It seems like the experience is changing even though the representation is staying constant.
Right.
How do representationalists try to explain that?
Well, they have a few options.
Okay.
They could argue that there are actually subtle differences in the representations,
Hmm.
even though they're not immediately apparent to us.
Okay.
Or they could propose that our attention or focus shifts
Mm.
between different aspects of the representation, leading to different experiences.
So they're basically trying to find some way to explain the different experiences by
Right.
appealing to some hidden difference in the representations.
Exactly. But some critics argue that these explanations are ad hoc,
Ad hoc.
meaning they're just added on to save the theory rather than arising naturally from the theory itself.
Okay, so the Necker cube is one counterexample.
Right.
Are there any others, any other cases where experience seems to diverge from representation?
There are several. Another one involves blurry vision.
Okay.
Imagine you're looking at a sharp object through a blurry lens.
Hmm.
The object itself is sharp, but it looks blurry to you.
Okay.
Now compare that to looking at an object that's actually blurry, like a painting with blurred edges.
All right, so in both cases, I'm seeing blurriness.
Yeah.
What's the issue for representationalism?
The problem is that the experience of blurriness feels different in these two cases. When looking through the blurry lens, you know the object is sharp,
Right.
and the blurriness feels like it's imposed by the lens,
Right.
not an inherent property of the object itself.
But with the blurry painting, the blurriness feels like it's part of the object.
Right.
Like it's built into the way the artist created it.
Exactly. So the challenge for representationalism is to explain how these different experiences of blurriness can arise, even though in both cases you're supposedly representing blurriness.
I can see how that would be tricky.
Yeah.
Like, how do you represent the difference between blurriness as a property of the object and blurriness as a result of my own distorted perception?
Right.
It seems like more than just the content of the representation is at play here.
You're hitting on a crucial point. These counterexamples raise deep questions about the nature of sensory qualities.
Yeah.
And whether they're truly out there in the world or somehow constructed by our minds.
Right.
And these questions go beyond the scope of representationalism itself, touching on fundamental issues in philosophy of perception and metaphysics.
Whoa, that's getting pretty deep.
Ah,
Sounds like we're venturing into territory where even the experts don't have all the answers.
that's the beauty of philosophy. There's always more to explore. Right.
More to question
Yeah.
and more to debate.
Well said. So, after considering all the arguments and counter-arguments, where does this leave us? Yeah. What's the final verdict on representationalism?
Like any good philosophical theory, representationalism has its strengths and weaknesses.
Okay.
It offers a compelling framework for understanding how our experiences relate to the physical world, particularly when it comes to perception.
Right.
It's also compatible with materialism, which many find appealing. But it also faces some tough challenges, particularly when trying to account for the more subtle and subjective aspects of experience, those nuances of what it's like.
Right. It's a reminder that consciousness is incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And even our most advanced theories are probably just scratching the surface.
Exactly. But that's what makes it so fascinating to study.
Mm-hmm.
There's always more to learn, more to discover,
Yeah.
and more to wonder about.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the representational theory of consciousness.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the basic idea of representation to the different types of representationalism, the arguments in favor and against the theory,
Right.
and even those mind-bending counterexamples.
Absolutely.
It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and hopefully our listeners are now equipped to delve even deeper into the mysteries of consciousness on their own.
I hope so.
Absolutely. So, to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep that philosophical curiosity alive. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.